In the year 2000, a construction crew broke through a basement wall in Boston. They found a tunnel that had been hidden for 5 years. The discovery didn't make sense until they traced the address of the building above. It was the last known residence of Judge Arthur Finch, a man who had vanished from his apartment in 1995, leaving behind a half-eaten breakfast and a cup of coffee that was still warm. For 5 years, the case had been a ghost, a file that collected dust on a detective's desk, a story that the city had mostly forgotten. But the hole in the wall changed everything. It was a dark, narrow mouth leading into the cold earth beneath the city, and it promised to finally speak about what had happened to the judge. The call went to his son, Thomas Finch. He was 35 now, but he still felt like the boy who had first reported his father missing. For half a decade, he had lived in a state of suspended grief, a life paused on the image of that breakfast table. He had imagined every terrible possibility, from a random act of violence to a calculated revenge plot from one of the many criminals his father had sent away. None of his theories, however, had ever included a tunnel. He drove to the old brownstone, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The street was already blocked off, flashing blue and red lights painting the familiar brick in alien colors. He saw the police tape, a yellow ribbon stretched across the entrance to his father's old life. Detective Miller was waiting for him. Miller was a man made of coffee and cigarettes, his face a roadmap of frustrating cases. The Finch disappearance was his biggest failure, the one that haunted him late at night. He looked at Thomas, his expression grim. He didn't offer condolences or false hope. He just nodded toward the building service entrance. "There's something you need to see," he said, his voice low and gravelly. They descended into the basement, a place that smelled of damp concrete and forgotten things. The air was thick with dust kicked up by the workers. In the far corner, where a section of the foundation had been removed for plumbing work, was the opening. It wasn't large, just a rough, dark square cut into the ancient stone and dirt. It looked less like an entrance and more like a wound in the earth. A generator hummed nearby, powering a string of work lights that disappeared into the blackness. Thomas stared at it, his mind struggling to connect this raw physical hole with his father, a man of books, of law, of immaculate suits and polished shoes. How could this be part of his story? One of the officers handed Miller a flashlight. The beam cut into the darkness, revealing crudely dug walls of packed earth, braced with rotting wooden beams. It was suffocatingly narrow. The detective looked back at Thomas, his eyes asking a question. "Do you want to do this?" Thomas felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years. Not grief, but a chilling, electric certainty. The answer to his father's silence was in there. He had to know. He gave a single, determined nod. He had to see where it led. He had to walk the path that, 5 years ago, his father was forced to take. The thought sent a tremor through him. He was about to step into his father's tomb, or worse, the place where his last moments of terror were spent. The air from the tunnel felt cold, ancient, and it carried a faint, unidentifiable smell, like wet soil and something else, something metallic and bitter. It was the smell of secrets. They stepped into the tunnel, one after the other, their world shrinking to the narrow beam of the flashlight. The air immediately grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. It was cold, a deep, cellar-like chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Thomas had to duck his head, his shoulders brushing against the rough, soil-caked walls. He could feel loose dirt trickling down his neck. Above them, he could hear the faint, muffled rumble of city life, a distant train, the low thrum of traffic, sounds from a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away. This was a place outside of time, a secret passage hidden beneath the feet of oblivious pedestrians. Detective Miller led the way, his flashlight beam dancing ahead, revealing the crude construction. Wooden 2x4s, many of them warped and stained with moisture, served as support braces. They were placed at irregular intervals, suggesting the work of someone who was desperate, not professional. Who would dig something like this? The effort would have taken months, maybe longer. It required a level of obsessive dedication that was terrifying to consider. Thomas thought of the Mafia stories, the whispers of revenge from the Costello crime family. He had always pictured a swift, brutal abduction from the street. Not this. This was slow, patient, and deeply personal. This was hatred that had been nurtured in the dark. The tunnel ran straight for about 50 feet and then began a gentle, almost imperceptible slope downward. The floor was uneven, a mix of packed dirt and loose stones that shifted under their feet. Thomas reached out a hand to steady himself against the wall, and his fingers sank slightly into the cold, damp soil. He pulled his hand back, unnerved. He imagined his father being dragged through here, the rough walls scraping his skin, the darkness absolute. Did he fight? Did he scream? Or was he silent, paralyzed by the sheer, unbelievable horror of it? Miller stopped for a moment, listening. The only sound was their own breathing, loud and labored in the confined space. "What are we looking for?" Thomas asked, his voice a strained whisper. The detective didn't turn around. "I don't know," he answered. "But a tunnel like this isn't dug for a friendly visit. It was built for one reason, to move someone from one place to another without being seen. The question is, from where to where?" They kept moving. The flashlight beam caught something on the floor. Miller crouched down. It was a button. A simple, dark plastic button from a man's coat. It was caked in mud, but Thomas recognized it instantly. It was from his father's favorite tweed jacket, the one he wore around the apartment on cool mornings, the one he was likely wearing the day he disappeared. The sight of it, so small and ordinary, made the situation violently real. This was no longer an abstract mystery. His father was here. This small piece of plastic was proof. It was a breadcrumb left behind in a nightmare. Miller picked it up with a gloved hand and placed it in an evidence bag without a word. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The button confirmed their fears. They were on the right path. They were following the judge's last journey. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel ended abruptly at a stone wall, different from the foundation of the judge's building. This was older, made of large, irregular field stones. But there was a section, low to the ground, where the stones had been replaced with bricks, mortared poorly. It was a makeshift seal. Miller examined the edges. "The mortar is newer than the rest of this," he said. "Someone came through here and sealed it back up." He took the back of his heavy flashlight and struck one of the bricks near the center. It gave a hollow sound. He struck it again, harder this time, and the brick cracked, falling inward into another dark space. A wave of stale, musty air washed over them. It smelled of dust, mold, and profound neglect. Miller and another officer worked together, pulling away the loose bricks, creating an opening just large enough to crawl through. On the other side was another basement, pitch black. Miller shone his light inside. The beam illuminated a vast, empty space, littered with debris. They were in another building. They had crossed under the street. They crawled through the opening, one by one, into the basement of the abandoned house. The air was thick with the dust of decades, a fine gray powder that coated every surface and filled their lungs with the taste of decay. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing a space that had been left to rot. Cobwebs as thick as cotton hung from the exposed pipes overhead, and the concrete floor was littered with old newspapers, broken bottles, and the skeletal remains of a rat. It was a place of total neglect. Miller swept his light across the room. "Who owns this place?" Thomas asked, his voice muffled by the oppressive stillness. The detective was already on his radio, relaying the address to the officers outside. They'd find out soon enough, but a quick look around told them what they needed to know. The house had been empty for a very, very long time. A set of rickety wooden stairs led up from the basement. With guns drawn, 2 officers took the lead, their footsteps creaking loudly on the decaying wood. Thomas and Miller followed close behind. The ground floor was just as desolate. The windows were boarded up, casting the rooms in a permanent twilight. Faded, peeling wallpaper hung in strips from the walls, revealing the dark, stained plaster beneath. There was no furniture, no sign that anyone had lived here for years. It was a hollow shell, a perfect place to hide something, or someone. They moved through the house methodically, room by empty room. The silence was unnerving. Every creak of the floorboards, Every whisper of wind through the cracked window panes felt significant. It felt like the house was holding its breath, guarding a terrible secret. They reached the second floor. More empty rooms. A bathroom with a rust-stained tub. A bedroom with a gaping hole in the ceiling where rain and time had eaten through the roof. It seemed like the trail had gone cold. Perhaps this was just a dead end, a place to enter the tunnel and nothing more. But then they came to the last room at the end of the hall. The door was closed. Unlike the others, which were all ajar, this one was shut tight. One of the officers pushed it open. It swung inward with a low, groaning complaint, and they saw it. The room was not empty. In the very center of the floor, positioned directly under a bare, dust-covered light bulb, was a single wooden chair. It was a simple, straight-backed kitchen chair, old and unremarkable, but its placement felt deliberate, like a piece of stagecraft. It was facing the door, as if waiting for an audience. The floorboards around the legs of the chair were deeply scarred. Thomas moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't need Miller to tell him what he was looking at. The marks were unmistakable. They were deep, gouged lines in the wood, wrapping around the base of the chair legs, the kind of marks left by ropes pulled tight, straining against a heavy weight. Someone had been tied to this chair. For a long time, the image flooded his mind with such force that he almost staggered. His father, a man of immense dignity and authority, a federal judge who commanded respect in the highest courts of the land, bound to this cheap, filthy chair in this forgotten room. The humiliation, the terror. It was a violation so profound it stole the air from his lungs. The room was otherwise bare. The walls were empty. The floor swept clean. Too clean. Miller noticed it, too. "This room has been wiped down," he said, his voice tight. "Whoever was here, they were careful. They wanted to leave nothing behind. But they had. They had left the chair. They had left the marks on the floor. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message. It was a statement. This is what we did to him. This is where he suffered." Thomas just stood there, staring at the empty chair, the silence of the room screaming louder than any sound he had ever heard. It was the centerpiece of a private, hellish theater, and his father had been its only actor. He felt a cold dread creep over him. What else had they left behind? What other proof of their cruelty was hidden in this house? The forensics team arrived, and the abandoned house transformed from a quiet tomb into a busy, methodical workspace. They worked under the harsh glare of portable floodlights. Their hushed, professional voices, a stark contrast to the house's oppressive silence. They dusted for fingerprints, collected fiber samples, and photographed every inch of the room with the chair. But it was just as Detective Miller had suspected. The room was unnervingly clean. Whoever had used this space knew what they were doing. They had wiped every surface, bleached the floor, and left behind almost nothing for the police to find. It was the work of disciplined, patient criminals, not common thugs. The Mafia theory felt more certain than ever. The Costello family had the means and the motive. This level of meticulous cleanup was their signature. Thomas watched them work, feeling a growing sense of hopelessness. They had found the place of his father's torment, but it was an empty stage. The actors were long gone. He felt Miller place a hand on his shoulder. "Let's step outside," he said gently. "There's nothing more for us to do in here right now." They went to stand on the front porch of the derelict house, breathing in the cool evening air. The street was still a circus of official vehicles and curious neighbors held back by police tape. Thomas looked across the street at his father's building. From here, it looked so normal, so peaceful. It was impossible to believe that a secret passage of such horror connected these two buildings. Hours passed. The initial excitement of the discovery faded, replaced by the grim reality of a cold trail. The forensics team found nothing of value. No prints, no DNA, no stray hairs. The house had given up its most obvious secret, the chair, but was holding on to the rest. Just as Miller was about to call it a night, one of the younger officers, a rookie named Evans, called out from inside the room, "Detective, you need to see this." There was an urgency in his voice that cut through the weary atmosphere. Miller and Thomas rushed back inside. Evans was on his knees in the corner of the room, a small crowbar in his hand. He had been checking the floorboards, a tedious but necessary task. One of them felt loose, he explained, his voice trembling slightly. He had pried it up. Beneath the floorboard was a small, dark cavity, and inside that cavity was an object. Evans shone his flashlight into the hole. Tucked away in the darkness was a single Polaroid photograph. It was lying face down. Miller knelt, his own movements slow and deliberate. Using his gloved hands, he carefully reached into the space and retrieved the picture. He held it for a moment, its back a blank white square. Before turning it over, the detective's face went rigid, every bit of color drained from it. He stared at the image, his expression a mixture of shock and profound pity. He looked up at Thomas, and in his eyes, Thomas saw the answer to a question he was too terrified to ask. "Let me see it," Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. Miller hesitated, then handed him the photograph. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was his father, Judge Arthur Finch. He was sitting in the very chair that was now just a few feet away from them. His hands were bound in front of him, his body held captive by ropes that dug into his expensive suit. But it was his face that shattered Thomas's soul. His eyes were wide, with a terror so pure, so absolute, that it seemed to leap from the glossy surface of the photo. His mouth was open in a silent scream. It was the face of a man who had stared into the abyss and seen it stare back. And in his bound hands he was being forced to hold something up for the camera. It was a newspaper, a copy of the Boston Globe. Thomas could just make out the date printed at the top, October 12, 1995, the day he disappeared. It was a proof-of-life photo, but it was also a proof of torment. A trophy. The kidnappers hadn't just taken his father. They had documented his breaking point. They had captured his soul at the moment it left his body. Thomas felt his legs give way, and he leaned against the wall for support, the Polaroid shaking in his hand. The hope he had secretly clung to for 5 years, that his father had somehow escaped, or that his end had been quick, was annihilated by this single, cruel image. He was looking at the last moment of his father's life, a moment of pure, undiluted horror, and it had been left here for them to find. It wasn't a clue. It was the final act of sadism. The discovery of the Polaroid photograph changed everything. It yanked the Finch case from the cold case files and threw it onto the front pages of the newspapers. The image itself was not released to the public, but the description of it was enough. The city was gripped by the story once more, a tale of a respected judge, a secret tunnel, and a terrifying final photograph. The investigation, which had been dormant for 5 years, was now a top priority. The local police were joined by the FBI. The prevailing theory solidified into a single, cohesive narrative. This was a Mafia hit. Judge Arthur Finch was famous, or infamous, for his war on organized crime in the late 80s and early 90s. He had presided over the trials of some of Boston's most powerful mob figures, handing down sentences with an iron will and a refusal to be intimidated. His most notable case was that of Vincent the Saint Costello, the patriarch of the Costello crime family. Finch had sentenced him to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, effectively dismantling his empire. Vincent Costello had died in prison of a heart attack in 1994, just 1 year before the judge vanished. The timeline was too perfect to be a coincidence. The FBI was convinced this was a vendetta killing, an act of posthumous revenge carried out by Costello's loyal soldiers. They believed the family had spent a year planning the abduction, digging the tunnel, and preparing their torture chamber. The Polaroid was their way of sending a message back to the grave of their fallen boss. The debt had been paid. The investigation now had a clear direction. Agents began re-interviewing known Costello associates, leaning on old informants, and digging into the family's activities around 1995. Thomas was caught in the middle of this storm. He was questioned for hours, asked to recount every detail about his father's life, his habits, his enemies. Did the judge ever mention threats? Was he acting paranoid? Did he have any unusual routines? Thomas told them everything he could remember. But his father had been a deeply private man. He rarely spoke of his work at home. He built a wall between his professional life and his personal life. A wall Thomas now realized might have hidden more than just the stress of his job. The focus of the investigation narrowed onto two of Vincent Costello's nephews, the Carlini brothers. They were known enforcers, violent and fiercely loyal to their uncle. They had dropped off the radar shortly after the judge's disappearance, rumored to have fled to Italy. The FBI saw this as a clear admission of guilt. They began the long, complicated process of trying to locate them overseas. For the first time in 5 years, there was momentum. There were suspects. There was a motive. It felt like they were on the brink of solving it. Thomas found himself clinging to this theory because it was simple. It was clean. It was a story of good versus evil, of a righteous judge struck down by the wicked men he had fought to put away. It was a narrative that preserved his father's legacy. He preferred it to the chaotic, unknowable horror of a random act. A few weeks into the renewed investigation, an old informant, spooked by the renewed pressure, reached out to Detective Miller. He claimed to have heard whispers back in the day. He gave Miller a name, a low-level Costello associate named Paulie Gallo. The informant said Paulie had been bragging around that time, saying he was involved in a job that would make the family proud. He had hinted that it involved making a big man disappear into the earth. It was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Paulie Gallo. A name, a face, a tangible link to the crime. Miller and a team of FBI agents tracked him down. He was still in Boston, living a quiet life, running a small bakery in the North End. They found him there, covered in flour, a shadow of the tough young mobster he had once been. They took him in for questioning. Thomas waited at the station, his hope soaring. This was it. This man held the key. He would tell them where his father's body was. He would give them the closure they had been denied for so long. Hours later, Miller emerged from the interrogation room. His face was not triumphant. It was frustrated, tired. "Gallo has an alibi," Miller said, his voice flat. "A rock-solid, ironclad alibi. He was in the hospital for 3 weeks with a burst appendix during the time the judge went missing. Multiple doctors, nurses, and hospital records confirm it. He wasn't bragging about the judge. He was talking about burying a rival's car in a construction site. It was just empty talk. The lead, the one that had seemed so promising, evaporated into thin air. The momentum was gone. The case, which had been sprinting forward, had just run headfirst into a brick wall. The Costello theory, once so solid, now felt hollow. They were back where they started, with a tunnel, a chair, and a photograph. The collapse of the Paulie Gallo lead sent a wave of deflation through the investigation. The FBI quietly shifted its resources to other cases, leaving Detective Miller once again with the primary burden of the Finch file. The media buzz faded, and the city's attention moved on. For Thomas, it was worse than before. They had been so close to an answer, even if it was a horrible one. Now, he was back in the familiar, suffocating fog of the unknown. The simple narrative of a Mafia hit had been comforting in its own way. Without it, the possibilities became darker, more chaotic. Who else would have the patience, the sheer hatred, to dig that tunnel? Frustrated and unwilling to let the case go cold again, Miller decided to start over from the very beginning. He took out the original files from 1995, reading through every witness statement, every initial report, looking for something, anything, that might have been missed. Most of it was useless. Neighbors who saw nothing. A mailman who didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. But one statement caught his eye. It was from an elderly woman named Eleanor Gable, who had lived in the apartment directly below Judge Finch. Her original statement was brief and had been largely dismissed at the time. She had claimed to hear noises. The initial investigators had noted she seemed confused and prone to rambling. They had written her off. Miller decided to pay her a visit. He found her living in a nursing home just outside the city. She was frail, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She remembered him, and she remembered the judge. "He was a good man," she said. Very quiet. Kept to himself. Miller gently steered the conversation back to the noises she had reported. "I want you to tell me about them again," he said. "Everything you can remember." Mrs. Gable looked out the window, her gaze distant, traveling back in time. "It wasn't just that one day," she said, her voice thin but steady. "The first officers who came, they didn't listen. They thought I was a crazy old woman, but the noises had been going on for a long time." Miller leaned forward. "How long?" She thought for a moment. "At least 2 years, maybe 3. Long before he disappeared. They were faint. I only heard them late at night, when the city was quiet. It sounded like digging. A scratching, scraping sound from below my floor. I told the building manager, but he said it was just the pipes. And sometimes I heard voices." Miller felt a chill run down his spine. "Voices?" "Yes," she whispered, as if sharing a forbidden secret. "Faint, muffled, like people talking in the cellar. Sometimes it sounded like they were arguing. I couldn't make out the words. I just knew they were there. I called them my voices from underground. My daughter said it was just the television from next door, but I knew it wasn't. It came from the floor." This changed the entire timeline. The official theory was that the tunnel was dug specifically for the abduction in the months leading up to it. But if Mrs. Gable was right, the tunnel, and the people using it, had been there for years while his father was living right above it. Why? A tunnel wasn't just a tool for a single kidnapping. If it had been there for years, it was a permanent fixture. A secret world existing right under the judge's feet. Did he know? Was he a part of it? The thought was absurd. Judge Arthur Finch was a man of unimpeachable integrity. But the question lingered, a poisonous seed planted in Miller's mind. The purpose of the tunnel was not what they thought. It wasn't just an escape route. It was an entryway. The people who took the judge didn't drag him out of his building and into the tunnel. They came for him from the tunnel. They had access to his building from below, but that still didn't explain the years of activity. Why would they dig for years, only to use it once? Miller thanked Mrs. Gable, his mind racing. He now had a new, terrifying hypothesis. The kidnapping wasn't the entire story. It was just the end of it. The real story, the one that had unfolded in secret for years, was about the voices from underground. The judge hadn't been the victim of a random or sudden attack. He had been living on top of a secret that was slowly, patiently, digging its way toward him. The revelation from Mrs. Gable forced Detective Miller and Thomas to look at the case through a completely new lens. The judge wasn't just a victim. He was the target of a long, sustained campaign of psychological terror. The tunnel wasn't merely a tool for abduction. It was a stage for a drama that had played out for years, in secret. The central question now became, did Judge Finch know about the tunnel? Was he aware of the people moving beneath his home? The idea seemed preposterous. Arthur Finch was a man who valued order and control above all else. He would have reported such a thing immediately. Unless he couldn't. Unless there was a reason he had to keep it secret. With a new sense of purpose, Miller got the keys to the judge's old apartment. It had been unsealed after the initial investigation years ago, but had remained unoccupied, a silent monument to its missing owner. Thomas had managed the estate, leaving his father's study exactly as it was, unable to bring himself to dismantle that part of his life. Together, they walked back into the apartment. It was strange and familiar at the same time. A thin layer of dust covered everything, and the air was stale, but the ghost of his father was everywhere, in the books that lined the walls, in the worn leather of his favorite armchair, in the faint scent of pipe tobacco that still clung to the curtains. They weren't looking for signs of a struggle anymore. They were looking for a secret, for something out of place in a life that was meticulously ordered. They searched for hours. They went through his desk, his financial records, his personal letters. They found nothing. Everything was exactly as it should be for a retired federal judge. It was a life of perfect integrity, at least on paper. Thomas was about to give up, the weight of another dead end pressing down on him. He was standing in the study, running his hand along a row of heavy law books on a built-in bookshelf. As his fingers traced the spines, he felt a slight give in the wooden paneling behind them. It moved. He pushed aside the books. Behind them, nearly invisible against the dark wood, was the faint outline of a small square panel. There was no knob, no handle. But when he pressed on one corner, it clicked open. It was a hidden compartment. Inside was a heavy, gray metal strongbox. It was locked. Miller looked at Thomas, his eyes wide with anticipation. They didn't have the key, but that didn't matter. They took the box back to the station and had the lock cracked by the department's technician. Thomas felt his heart pounding as the technician finally forced the lid open. He half expected to find money, or perhaps sensitive documents from one of his father's old cases. But what they found was far more personal and far more disturbing. The box was filled with micro-cassette tapes, dozens of them, each labeled with a date in his father's precise, elegant handwriting. The dates spanned a period of nearly 3 years, ending just 2 days before he disappeared. Beneath the tapes were several small leather-bound journals. Thomas picked one up and opened it. The pages were filled with his father's script, but it was not the calm, measured handwriting he knew. This was frantic, slanted, and chaotic. The words were a torrent of fear and paranoia. "They were here again last night," one entry read. "The sound is in the walls. I can't sleep. They are always listening." Another entry spoke of a debt that can never be repaid, a sin that has found me out. It was the secret diary of a man living in his own private prison. The strong, unshakable judge he knew was gone, replaced by a terrified man haunted by something he could not escape. Miller took one of the tapes and looked at the date on the label. Then he walked over to a small cassette player on his desk. He put the tape in, the plastic clicking into place. He looked at Thomas, a silent question in his eyes. "Is this a secret you are prepared to learn?" Thomas could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. The carefully constructed image of his father was already crumbling. Now he had to hear the truth, in his father's own voice. Miller pressed the play button. The speakers hissed with static for a moment, and then a voice filled the room. It was his father's voice, but it was strained, trembling with a fear that Thomas had never heard before. "Please," the recorded voice begged, "just tell me what you want." The voice on the tape was unmistakably his father's, but it was a version Thomas had never known. It was stripped of all its authority, all its confidence. It was the voice of a man broken. After his father's recorded plea, another voice answered, this one rougher, filled with a cold, controlled anger. "We don't want anything you can give us, Judge. We're just here to remind you." Thomas and Miller listened, frozen, as the tape played out. It was a recording of a confrontation, a conversation between his father and at least 2 other men. The audio quality was poor, muffled, as if the recorder was hidden in a pocket or a drawer. But the content was terrifyingly clear. The men were not there to rob or physically harm his father. They were tormenting him. They spoke of a past crime, a terrible mistake the judge had made decades ago. Over several tapes, listening late into the night, Thomas and Miller pieced together the horrifying truth. Long before he was a federal judge, back when he was a young, ambitious prosecutor, Arthur Finch had made a deal with the devil to secure a conviction in a high-profile murder case. The pressure to close the case was immense. To guarantee a win, he had deliberately withheld a piece of evidence, a witness statement that would have provided a solid alibi for one of the accused men, a small-time associate of the Costello family named Marco Rossi. By burying that statement, Finch had ensured Rossi's conviction, and in doing so, had secured his own reputation as a brilliant, unyielding prosecutor. It was the case that made his career. But Marco Rossi was innocent of that crime. He died in prison 15 years later, still proclaiming his innocence. His family was destroyed. His 2 sons, Leo and Nico, grew up in the shadow of that injustice. They never forgot. The voices on the tape belonged to Leo and Nico Rossi. The voices from underground that Mrs. Gable had heard were theirs. They had spent years, fueled by a righteous, burning hatred, secretly digging the tunnel from the basement of the abandoned house their family still owned across the street. They didn't want Mafia-style revenge. They wanted something more cruel, more poetic. They wanted the judge to feel the same helpless terror their father had felt. They used the tunnel to gain access to his building, possibly through a hidden entry in the basement or service ducts. For years, they had come and gone like ghosts, their presence a constant, unseen threat. The tapes were recordings the judge had secretly made of their visits. They were the chronicles of his own private hell. The Rossi brothers would appear in his apartment late at night, confronting him, reminding him of his sin. They never laid a hand on him. They didn't have to. Their power was psychological. The judge was trapped. He couldn't go to the police, because to reveal their harassment would be to reveal his own crime, the secret that would destroy his legacy and everything he had built. He was being held hostage in his own home, forced to live in constant fear. The journals confirmed it. He wrote about hearing them move in the walls, of finding objects in his apartment slightly moved, of the constant, gnawing fear that they could appear at any moment. The powerful Judge Finch had been reduced to a prisoner, his meticulously ordered life a fragile facade hiding a spiraling nightmare. His polished shoes, his perfect suits, it was all an armor he wore to hide the fact that he was crumbling from the inside out. Thomas felt a wave of nausea. His father, the man he had idolized as a pillar of justice, had built his entire life on a lie. He was not the blameless victim of mobsters. He was a flawed man, whose past had literally dug its way out of the earth to claim him. The entire case, the entire 5-year mystery, was not about a kidnapping. It was about a reckoning. The last few tapes, dated in the final days before the disappearance, were the hardest to listen to. The judge's voice was almost gone, a dry, raspy whisper. The Rossi brothers sounded different too. Their patient, years-long campaign of terror was coming to an end. They were no longer content with just reminding him. They wanted a final resolution. On the last tape, recorded just 2 days before he vanished, their ultimatum was clear. "We're done talking, Judge," Leo's voice said, cold and final. "You've lived with this for years. Now it ends." They had brought a prepared confession with them, a document detailing Arthur Finch's crime from decades ago, the buried evidence, the false conviction of their father. "Sign it," Nico said. "Sign it, and we walk away. We'll release it to the press. Your name will be ruined, but you will live. Your son will know what you did, but he will still have a father. Refuse, and you will simply disappear. No one will ever know what happened to you. You will become another one of this city's ghosts." The tape recorded a long, agonizing silence. Thomas could hear the shaking of his father's hand as he picked up a pen. He could hear the rustle of the paper. Then, his father spoke. His voice, no longer just fearful, but filled with a strange, tragic resolve. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it was firm. There was a sound of surprise from the Rossi brothers. "What did you say?" Leo asked. My son will not know me as a disgrace," the judge said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. "He will remember me as I was. My legacy, my name, it's all I have left. If you want to silence me, you will have to do it completely." The tape then descended into chaos. There was the sound of a chair scraping violently across the floorboards, the same marks they had found in the abandoned house. A struggle. A muffled cry from his father. The Rossi brothers were shouting, their cold composure finally breaking. Then, a sharp, sickening thud. After that, only the sound of heavy breathing. And then, a click as the recorder was shut off. Thomas sat in stunned silence. He finally understood. His father hadn't been dragged away unwillingly. In his final moments, he had made a choice. A terrible, selfish, and somehow noble choice. He had chosen to protect his reputation over his own life. He had chosen to be a murdered hero rather than a disgraced living father. He had sacrificed his future with his son to preserve a lie. The Polaroid picture suddenly made a new, more horrifying kind of sense. It wasn't a proof-of-life photo for a ransom. It was the Rossi brothers' final, cruel trophy. They couldn't get his written confession. So they took a photographic one instead. They captured his terror on film, a permanent record of his final moments, a truth that only they would know. They left it under the floorboards, not as a clue for the police, but as a final, private act of desecration, a secret testament to their victory. They had taken him through the tunnel one last time. His body was never meant to be found. He was meant to simply vanish, leaving behind a mystery that would protect his name forever. Thomas finally understood the half-eaten breakfast. It wasn't a scene interrupted by a violent abduction. It was the last normal morning of a man who knew the end was coming, a man who went to his final terrible appointment with fate. The mystery was solved. But the truth was a poison. His father wasn't the man he thought he was. He was a man who committed a grave sin and then, when faced with the consequences, chose to be erased rather than be known. Thomas felt an unbearable mix of pity, anger, and a deep, hollow sadness. He had his answer, but it had cost him his father all over again. The tapes were never entered into evidence. The case of Judge Arthur Finch was officially closed, the file stamped with its final, unsatisfying conclusion. Disappeared, presumed deceased. Perpetrators unknown. To make the tapes public would be to posthumously destroy the judge's entire career and reputation, dragging his name and the integrity of the courts he served through the mud. It would answer the public's questions, but it would achieve nothing else. The Rossi brothers, Leo and Nico, were ghosts. Miller ran their names through every database he could. They had sold their family's assets, including the abandoned house, through a proxy company a month after the judge vanished. They had liquidated everything and disappeared. They were likely living under new names, in a country with no extradition treaty, their long, patient revenge complete. There was no trail to follow, no justice to be had. The truth would remain a secret, a heavy burden shared only by Thomas and the weary detective. A few months later, demolition crews arrived on the street. The abandoned house, the site of so much misery, was scheduled to be torn down to make way for a new condominium complex. Thomas stood on the sidewalk across the street, watching as a large excavator began to claw at the building's rotting facade. The walls came down in clouds of dust, revealing the hollow rooms inside, exposing them to the light for the first time in decades. He watched them tear into the foundation, the place where the tunnel began. He knew that deep below the ground, the secret passage had already been filled with concrete by the city, a permanent seal on its dark history. He thought about the Rossi brothers. He couldn't bring himself to hate them. Their actions were monstrous, but they were born from a grief and an injustice that he could now, in a terrible way, understand. They were the product of his father's sin. He thought about his father. The image he had held of him for his entire life, the stoic, righteous man of law, was gone forever, replaced by this new, tragic figure. A man so terrified of his own shadow that he walked into it willingly. There was no comfort in the truth. The not knowing had been a kind of open wound, but the knowing was a permanent scar, a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. He had lost his father 5 years ago, but he had lost the idea of his father just a few months ago, and the second loss felt deeper, more profound. As he stood there, watching the last of the house crumble to the ground, he didn't feel a need for vengeance or a desire for closure. There was no such thing. There was only the quiet, heavy reality of what had happened. The mystery was solved, but nothing was fixed. The story was over, but the pain remained. He was left with the silence, the tapes locked away in a safe, and the unshakable knowledge that some secrets are buried so deep, they pull whole lives down with them. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.